I believe that there's been some form of drag as long as there's been people, really.
I know that drag was a thing even in Shakespearean times.
Women were not allowed to perform. They were not allowed to perform in theater, so men would play as women in their parts.
So there's actually a rumor that the phrase drag comes from Shakespearean time, and it's an acronym standing for dressed resembling a girl, DRAG.
So pantomime is a theater style that's very popular in the UK and has been for a very long time. And drag shows up in that in a really interesting way of usually the female character who's seen as less desirable was played by a man in drag. And it was always tongue-in-cheek of, this is an ugly woman who's undesirable, and it's played by a man, and that was why it was played by a man. It bleeded into a lot of musicals and then into TV shows and movies of when we want to punish a woman for being assertive or ambitious or sexual, we have a man play that so that it's making fun of her masculinity, which then leads to misogyny and also transphobia, because then people see that, correlate it with trans women being undesirable.
I think in terms of the culture and language around drag that we think of now, that came out of the ballroom scene, which I think really took off in the 70s, 80s. It came from intersections of Latin and Black culture and queer culture.
Ballroom was just a safe space for like the most of the minority Black and trans women of the scenes to come together.
Drag Race definitely has depicted drag for a while as a man dressing as a woman, and so sometimes that gives people a false perception of what drag is. But in the real world of drag, there's definitely a lot of non-binary and trans drag performers in the real world of drag, and also a lot of AFAB performers as well.
Waterloo has a really diverse drag community, specifically diversity in gender identities. So there are so many trans people, there are so many non-binary folks.
I identify as trans-masc, non-binary, and I really like to push my trans identity into my drag as well.
My drag aesthetic is very clearly trans and non-binary. I keep the facial hair, the chest hair. I don't pad. I have my legs out. They're hairy. It's meant to be a beautiful fusion of what is seen as typically masculine and typically feminine. And that's just how my body exists, and I like to show that. So that's my drag, and my drag is pretty visible in the scene. But majority of other artists I know in the area are non-binary, trans, or do not cling closely to the constructs of male and female. And that leads to a lot of diversity in terms of we have a lot of drag kings, a lot of drag performers who do not adhere to the binary. We have a lot of drag creatures.
Drag, I feel like, especially over the last few years, has become a lot more expansive. And so, you can be like a drag alien or a drag frog or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be like very gendered as we've seen for traditional drag.
But it's not a universal acceptance, unfortunately. And right now there's a lot of anti-trans rhetoric even within the queer community. So unfortunately, there are definitely people who believe that drag is for cis men only and not anyone else.
And so a lot of people have been inspired by that in their drag, and then misogyny and transphobia shows up in their drag. So that for me has always been a really interesting thread to see where it started and where it is now, and a thread that I work pretty actively to dismantle, because women's bodies shouldn't be the butt of the joke. Trans women shouldn't be the butt of the joke. And if your drag is doing that, then for me, that's when your drag is invalid.